streaks of orange and deep purple, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Inside the car, the air was thick, too warm, too silent, too full of things neither of us wanted to say. I had been in this car for hours, enduring the rhythmic hum of the tires, the occasional tap of fingers against the steering wheel. The journey had been anything but comfortable. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, layered with unspoken tension. My husband had promised to pick me up himself, but at the last moment he sent his son instead. An inconvenience for both of us. I knew why he had done it, work always work, but it didn't make the situation any less frustrating. Now I was stuck in a confined space with someone I barely considered family. My stepson had his father's confidence but none of his restraint. He exuded an easy arrogance, a presence that demanded attention without trying. His effortless charm grated on me in a way I couldn't quite explain. We had never been particularly close. There was always a polite distance, an underlying knowledge that we were tied together by circumstance rather than choice. The drive had been uneventful, long stretches of highway, the occasional road sign, scattered clusters of trees blurring past the window. But then without warning the car jerked violently. A loud clunk followed by a sputtering sound. The engine coughed then died. The silence that followed was deafening. The car rolled to a slow, painful stop on the side of the road. He twisted the key in the ignition once, twice. Nothing. The engine refused to turn over. I reached for my phone, glancing at the screen. No service. Of course. Stepping outside, I felt the lingering heat of the pavement through the soles of my shoes. The air smelled of dust and dry grass. The road was empty, stretching in both directions with no sign of civilization in sight. No gas stations, no houses, no passing cars. Just the fading sunlight and the eerie stillness of an abandoned highway. There was no point in arguing about whose fault it was. The car was dead. We were stuck. There was nothing to do but walk. The landscape remained unchanged as we moved forward, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath our feet the only sound breaking the silence. Every so often I could feel his gaze flicker toward me as if waiting for me to complain. But I didn't. There was no use in speaking when there was nothing productive to say. After what felt like an eternity, a faint glow appeared in the distance. A neon sign, buzzing weakly against the dimming sky. Motel. Relief washed over me. The building was exactly what I expected. A tired, peeling exterior, a cracked parking lot with faded white lines, a flickering vacancy sign that barely clung to life. The inside wasn't any better. The air was stale, thick with the scent of cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning supplies. A man stood behind the counter, barely lifting his gaze as we entered. He slid a guest book toward us, his movements slow, indifferent. His presence, much like the motel itself, suggested he had seen countless stranded travelers just like us. The last available room was ours. Just one room. I didn't bother arguing. There was no point. It had already been a long day and exhaustion weighed heavy in my limbs. One night. That was all. The motel room was even smaller than I expected, with faded wallpaper curling at the edges and a single dim lamp casting long shadows against the walls. The bed, disappointingly large for a single room, took up most of the space, its worn-out sheets slightly wrinkled as if someone had just left it. The air smelled of stale air freshener, a mix of synthetic citrus and something unidentifiable. Neither of us said a word as he dropped his bag near the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable, his movements slow, deliberate, almost reluctant. I placed my purse on the rickety nightstand, my fingers grazing over the dusty surface before I turned away, trying to ignore the unavoidable reality of our situation. The room was too small, the tension too thick, the silence too loud. There was no couch, no chair, nowhere else to go. We were trapped in this space together, forced into an arrangement neither of us had chosen. I could feel his presence behind me, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us, but I refused to look at him, refused to acknowledge what was already obvious. This was uncomfortable for both of us. I kept my back to him, staring at the outdated television mounted to the wall, the muted flicker of its standby light the only movement in the room. Hours passed in heavy silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, until the quiet became unbearable and words spilled from my lips before I could stop them. I didn't even know why I said it or what compelled me to break the unspoken rule we had both silently agreed upon, but suddenly I was admitting something I had never said out loud before. I was unhappy. The words hung in the air, fragile and raw, filling the space between us like something tangible, something irreversible. I expected indifference, maybe even amusement, but when I finally turned to face him, there was none of that. His expression had shifted, his usual smirk gone, his gaze steady, unexpectedly sincere. He was listening, really listening, not out of obligation or politeness, but with a quiet intensity that caught me off guard. The way he looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time, sent a strange, unidentifiable warmth through my chest, something dangerously close to comfort. I exhaled slowly, suddenly aware of just how close we were standing, just how little space separated us, just how much I had already let my guard down without realizing it. The bottle of cheap motel wine sat between us on the nightstand, half empty, the deep red liquid staining the insides of our glasses as we slowly swirled them in absent-minded circles. The night had stretched on longer than either of us expected, conversation ebbing and flowing in ways that felt too natural, too easy, as if the weight of the day had finally worn down the invisible walls we had carefully built between us. The lamp cast a soft, flickering glow, making everything feel hazy, indistinct, like we existed in some in-between place where reality felt just out of reach. I wasn't sure when it had happened, when the space between us had shrunk, when the air had grown heavier, charged with something neither of us was willing to acknowledge, but I could feel it pressing against my skin, pulling me toward him in ways I didn't understand. My fingers traced the rim of my glass as I watched him, the sharp angles of his face softened by the dim lighting, the usual confidence in his expression replaced by something quieter, something unreadable. His knee brushed against mine, barely a touch, but enough to send a jolt of awareness through me, enough to remind me of where we were, of who we were, of the lines we weren't supposed to cross. I should have moved, should have pulled away, but I didn't, and neither did he. The tension crackled between us, thick and undeniable, neither of us speaking, neither of us breaking the moment that had somehow taken on a life of its own. My breath hitched as his fingers ghosted over my wrist, the contact so light it could have been accidental, but it wasn't, and we both knew it. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned my head just slightly, just enough for my gaze to catch his, just enough to see the silent question lingering there, waiting for an answer neither of us should have wanted to give. And then, before I could think, before I could stop it, before logic had a chance to intervene, his lips were on mine, soft, hesitant, but full of something raw, something real, something we both knew was a mistake the second it happened. The shock of it sent a sharp, electric current down my spine, but reality crashed over me just as quickly, and I pulled away, breathless, my heart hammering, my mind racing. His eyes searched mine, waiting for permission, for a reaction, for something I wasn't willing to give, and I did the only thing I could. I shook my head, whispered that this never happened, that we would forget, that it meant nothing, even though we both knew that was a lie. Morning arrived too soon, dragging with it the sharp sting of reality, replacing the hazy warmth of the night with something cold and unforgiving. The air inside the motel room was stiff, thick with the weight of what had happened, but neither of us acknowledged it as we moved around each other like strangers forced to share the same space. I busied myself with routine, fixing my hair, straightening my clothes, pretending like I didn't feel his presence every time he shifted, like I didn't notice the way his gaze flickered toward me and away just as quickly, as if afraid that too much eye contact might unravel whatever fragile illusion we were trying to maintain. The bed, still slightly rumpled, felt like a silent accusation, a reminder of the mistake we had both agreed to forget, and yet neither of us could shake it off, the memory lingering like an echo in the corners of the room. The silence stretched, uncomfortable yet necessary, as if speaking would only breathe life into what we were so desperately trying to bury. The knock at the door came like a welcome distraction, and I was almost grateful when the motel clerk informed us that the mechanic had arrived, but the relief was short-lived when we reached the garage, and the man in greasy overalls shook his head with a tired sigh. The damage was worse than expected, parts needed to be ordered, and the soonest we'd be able to leave would be tomorrow. Another night. Another stretch of hours we'd have to navigate around each other, pretending we hadn't already stepped too close to something dangerous. The ride back to the motel was silent, the space between us in the car feeling too small, too heavy with all the things we weren't saying. I focused on the scenery outside, the blur of trees, the endless road, anything to keep my thoughts from straying to the night before, to the way his lips had felt against mine, to the way my pulse had betrayed me in that split second before I had pulled away. By the time we reached the motel, the air was so thick with tension that it felt suffocating, Each movement calculated, each glance carefully avoided, each breath measured as if any misstep might shatter the thin layer of control we had left. We were keeping our distance, keeping things neutral, playing our parts, but it was all just an act and we both knew it wouldn't hold forever. The drive to the city was long, but not long enough to clear my thoughts, not long enough to erase the weight of what I had been carrying since that night in the motel. The tension of the past 2 days still clung to my skin, but I forced myself to focus on what was ahead, on where I was going, on the man waiting for me at the end of this road. When I finally arrived, the hotel lobby was pristine, a sharp contrast to the place I had just left behind, all marble floors and hushed voices, the kind of place where everything felt controlled, measured, perfectly arranged. He was already there, waiting near the check-in desk, standing tall, composed, his phone in one hand, his briefcase in the other, the very image of a man who always had somewhere more important to be. His face lit up when he saw me, but the warmth in his expression didn't quite reach his eyes, and when he leaned in to kiss my cheek, the gesture felt too rehearsed, too automatic, like muscle memory rather than genuine affection. I smiled anyway, pretending not to notice, pretending this was just how things were after years together, pretending that I didn't suddenly feel the weight of comparison pressing down on me in a way that made my stomach twist. He led me upstairs to our suite, talking about work, about meetings, about deals that needed closing, his words flowing effortlessly as if he had never even considered that I might need something else from him, as if my presence here was nothing more than a convenient addition to his already structured life. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching him move around the room with practiced ease, taking off his watch, loosening his tie, settling into the space like he had done 1,000 times before. And then, in a moment of quiet desperation, I reached for him, pulling him toward me, pressing my lips to his in an attempt to remind myself why I was here, why I had chosen this life, why I had once thought this was an aberration. I reached for him, pulling him toward me, pressing my lips to his in an attempt to remind myself why I was here, why I had chosen this life, why I had once thought this was enough. But the moment our mouths met, I felt nothing. No spark, no warmth, no rush of familiarity that should have comforted me. Just emptiness. The realization settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and as I pulled away, I knew he hadn't even noticed. He was already moving on, already reaching for his phone, already slipping back into the world where I was nothing more than an afterthought. The silence in the hotel room felt deafening, stretching between us like an invisible chasm, widening with every second that passed. My husband had already moved on from our kiss, from me, from the moment I had desperately tried to make feel real. And now he sat on the far side of the room, his attention fixed on the screen of his phone, fingers gliding over the glass with the ease of someone who had mastered the art of distraction. I watched him, waiting for some kind of reaction, some sign that he had felt the same emptiness I had. But there was nothing, just the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional sigh as he read through whatever was more important than me. The realization settled over me like a slow, suffocating weight, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to pretend, harder to ignore the truth I had been avoiding for years. This was it. This was us. A marriage reduced to routine, to obligations, to distant gestures that meant nothing beyond habit. I had convinced myself for so long that this was normal, that this was just what love turned into over time, but now, sitting here feeling more alone than I ever had in my life, I knew that was a lie. And yet, even as that truth clawed its way through my mind, I wasn't ready to face the other one. The one that terrified me even more, the one that had been lingering just beneath the surface since that night in the motel. Because if I admitted that my marriage was over, if I let myself feel the full weight of that loss, then I would also have to admit what had taken its place, what had been growing in the spaces my husband had long since abandoned. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to acknowledge the way my pulse had quickened in that dimly lit room, the way my breath had caught in my throat, the way I had leaned in before pulling away. I wasn't ready to admit that it hadn't been just a mistake, that it hadn't been meaningless, that it hadn't been something I could simply erase. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sharp vibration breaking through my spiraling thoughts, and when I reached for it, my heart lurched in my chest. One new message. A name I shouldn't have wanted to see. A single line of text, simple, direct, cutting through every excuse, every lie, every desperate attempt to convince myself that I was still in control. Are you sure? The dim glow of the streetlights barely reached the corner of the quiet parking lot, casting long shadows across the pavement as I stood near the car, arms crossed, my pulse hammering against my ribs. He was already there, waiting, leaning against the driver's side door with the same frustrating ease, his expression unreadable, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The message he had sent still burned in the back of my mind, unraveling every excuse I had spent the last 24 hours building, forcing me to confront what I had been running from since the moment I left that motel. I had come here to put an end to it, to say the words out loud, to make it clear that what happened had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment, something that should never have happened and would never happen again. But the second I met his eyes, every practiced speech, every carefully rehearsed denial crumbled into dust. His gaze was steady, sharp, full of something I didn't want to name, something that made it impossible to breathe. I forced myself to speak, to say what needed to be said, to remind him and myself that this was wrong, that we were nothing, that we had imagined something out of nothing. But before I could finish, he laughed, a short, humorless sound that cut straight through my resolve. His voice was low, edged with something close to disbelief as he told me I was lying, that I was pretending, that I could say whatever I wanted, but it wouldn't change the truth. My hands curled into fists at my sides, anger bubbling beneath my skin, not at him but at myself, because he wasn't wrong, and that was the worst part. I pushed back, throwing words like daggers, insisting that he was young, that he didn't understand, that he was making something out of nothing. But the more I spoke, the more I could see it. The way his jaw tightened, the way his breath quickened, the way his entire body tensed like he was barely holding himself together. And then it happened. One step forward, one sharp inhale, one last moment where we both could have stopped it. His mouth crashed against mine, nothing soft or hesitant, just heat and frustration and something dangerously close to desperation. I froze, torn between every instinct to pull away and every part of me that wanted to stay, but the second my brain caught up to my body, I shoved him back and turned, my heart slamming against my ribs as I ran, as if distance could erase what had already been set into motion. The evening was supposed to be simple, predictable, controlled. A business gathering filled with polite conversations, expensive wine, and the kind of forced laughter that echoed through pristine hotel hallways. My husband had insisted I come, a gesture that felt more like an obligation than an invitation, a way to show me off rather than spend time with me. I had dressed for the occasion, slipping into the role I had played for years. The perfect wife, poised and elegant, standing beside him like an accessory rather than a person. The air buzzed with low conversations, the clinking of glasses, the soft hum of music filtering through the venue, and for a while, I managed to convince myself that this was fine, that I could get through the night without thinking about what had happened, without letting my mind wander to things it shouldn't. But then across the room I saw him. He wasn't supposed to be here. He stood near the bar, one hand resting casually on the counter, his posture relaxed but his gaze anything but. The moment our eyes met, something inside me shifted, a sharp jolt that sent The moment our eyes met, something inside me shifted, a sharp jolt that sent my pulse racing, a reminder of everything I had spent the last few days trying to suppress. I turned away too quickly, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass, my breath uneven, my thoughts spiraling. I could feel him watching me, feel the weight of unspoken words pressing into my skin, but I forced myself to stay where I was, to keep up appearances, to pretend like nothing had changed. Hours passed in slow increments, each second dragging heavier than the last, each moment thick with unrelenting tension. I knew I should leave, should create distance, should do anything but let myself be pulled towards something I had no business wanting. But the inevitability of it was stronger than my restraint. Somewhere between stolen glances and fleeting touches, between the carefully constructed walls we had both built and the undeniable pull tearing them down, we ended up in the same empty hallway, away from the noise, away from the crowd, away from everything except each other. The air was heavy, thick with something dangerous, something electric, something neither of us had the strength to fight anymore. His fingers graced mine, barely a touch, but enough to send a sharp current through my veins. I should have moved, should have stepped back, should have said something, anything to stop what was happening before it was too late. But instead I let the moment consume me. His mouth found mine, urgent, heated, raw, with all the things we had never said, with all the things we weren't supposed to feel. And that's when I heard it. A sharp intake of breath. The sound of movement. The unmistakable presence of someone else. I turned too fast, my stomach lurching, my heart slamming against my ribs. My husband stood there, his expression unreadable, his gaze locked onto mine, his silence louder than any accusation could have been. The silence was worse than shouting, worse than accusations, Worse than anything I had prepared myself for. My husband said nothing. He didn't demand answers, didn't ask for explanations, didn't show anger or betrayal, just looked at me for one unbearable second before turning and walking away. No confrontation, no spectacle, no final words. Just quiet acceptance, like a man who had already known the truth long before he ever had to see it. I wanted him to yell, to react, to feel something, but instead he simply left, his departure heavier than any words could have been. I stood frozen in that hallway, my pulse still hammering, my lips still tingling from a kiss that had lasted only a moment but had already destroyed everything. The next morning my stepson was gone. No message, no call, no chance for me to explain, to apologize, to do anything except watch as the last trace of him disappeared from my life. I searched for signs of him, his car, his luggage, anything that meant he hadn't left for good, but there was nothing. He had made his choice and it was the right one, the one I should have made a long time ago. I told myself it was for the best, that it was over now, that things could go back to the way they were, but deep down I knew better. Back at home everything looked the same. My husband carried on as if nothing had changed. He still left for work at the same time, still read the news over coffee, still spoke in the same calm, measured tone. If someone had watched us from the outside, they would have never guessed that anything had happened, that something inside our marriage had fractured beyond repair. But I could feel it. There was a wall now, an invisible barrier between us, thick and impenetrable. He still touched me, still kissed me on the cheek before he left for the office, still played his role as the devoted husband, but it was empty, mechanical, lifeless. He didn't ask where I had been or what I had been thinking. He didn't have to. We both knew there was nothing left to say. At night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, suffocating under the weight of the silence between us. I had lost them both in the same breath. One to distance, the other to quiet indifference, and in the end that was the worst punishment of all. The house felt colder than it ever had before, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the curtains. The silence stretched through every corner, filling the spaces where laughter and conversation had once existed, replacing them with something hollow, something lifeless. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching objects that no longer held meaning, running my fingers along picture frames that had started to gather dust, staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized in the mirror. The days blurred together, one bleeding into the next, an endless cycle of routine and obligation, of pretending everything was fine when nothing was. My husband still came home at the usual time, still greeted me with the same polite nod, still spoke to me as if I were a business partner rather than his wife. We shared meals in silence, sat across from each other at the dining table like two strangers forced to coexist in the same space. He never asked where I went during the day, never questioned the faraway look in my eyes, never pressed for explanations about something we both knew had no resolution. We lived together, but only in the most technical sense. There was no warmth, no tenderness, no anger, just the quiet resignation of two people who had accepted their fate without a fight. I could have left. I had thought about it more times than I could count, had even packed a bag once, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, staring at the suitcase filled with carefully folded clothes, convincing myself that walking away would be easier than staying. But in the end I never went through with it. I had built this life, tied myself to this man, and even now, after everything, after the silence, after the distance, after the weight of knowing I had lost something I could never get back, I stayed. And he was gone, really gone. He had disappeared without a word, cutting himself from my life as cleanly as if I had never existed. There were no messages, no late-night calls, no lingering looks across crowded rooms. Whatever connection we had imagined, whatever fragile, dangerous thing had sparked between us, had been buried beneath reality. I had nothing left but the memory of what almost was, the ache of something unfinished, the emptiness of knowing I had destroyed everything and gained nothing in return. I stood by the window watching the world move on without me. Cars passed, people laughed, life continued. But I just stood there, frozen, as if I no longer belonged to any of it.